You guys, if I say the name Robin Leach, do you know who I'm talking about? Life of the Rich and Famous. You guys remember this guy? It's really interesting when we think about hope. One of the questions that I had you guys think about and maybe answer to yourself last week was, I would have a lot more hope, or I'd be a lot happier in my life if I simply had blank. And a lot of us fill in that last blank with something like riches, something like fame, material success, something along those lines. And several decades ago, a professor at Knox College conducted a series of studies about people's values and life goals. And he took all of this into consideration. And truly, it's an indicator of where we can look for hope in a very fallen world. This study, as well as other similar studies across the world, concluded the exact same thing. And the conclusion was this: those who prioritize being rich, famous, or attractive are disproportionately more likely to suffer from anxiety, depression, and addictions. The studies also found something equally fascinating. It's not how rich, famous, or attractive a person is that determines their low sense of well-being, perhaps, but instead, it's the desire for those things that determines it. It's not what you have, it's not the things that you've accumulated that indicate that desire. It's the desire itself. It's what's behind those things. Remember the song Fame, Irene Cara, 1982? Somebody started out. I'm gonna live forever, right? Here's what she says. Fame, I'm gonna live forever. I'm gonna learn how to fly. I feel it coming together. People will see me and cry. I'm going to make it to heaven, light up the sky like a flame. I'm gonna live forever. Baby, remember my name. When you look for hope in something that is temporary and earthly, you will always feel like you're marginalized. You always feel like you won't have enough of whatever that blank is. And over the years, the effects of this pursuit, this worldly pursuit, have been documented and they've been realized, and it's well known. They're not assumptions anymore. However, not too many have looked to the cause of that desire for wealth, to the cause of that desire for fame. And I want to talk about that a little bit. Is it a strong desire for wealth that's caused by parents that were unnurturing? And so somebody has this obsession over finding something in the world that they didn't get from their upbringing. Is it an all-consuming desire for social validation? We see social media and the amount of people that are on social media now and what it's doing to families, to kids. It's unbelievable what's happening in social media. Maybe you've got something called the Michael Jordan drive. Remember when Michael Jordan didn't make his JV basketball team? And so he had some kind of it was a validation, it was a triumphant justification. I'll show them how much they should have put me on this team, and it just drove him, and it affected his hope, certainly. One possible explanation for the cause behind our desires, sinful desires as they are, has been termed TMT, terror management theory. The terror management theory suggests that much of our behavior is due to a reaction to our understood mortality. In other words, there's an existential reassurance that you get every time you go to a funeral or see the end of your life in front of you. That says, you know what, I need to bolster the self a little bit more so I can find a little bit more significance, a little bit more importance in these short days that I have remaining in my life. Another study mentioned an all too common trend. When your favorite sports teams, when let's just say OU wins the SEC championship this year. Let's just say that happens. All right, when they win if they win the championship, would you as an OU fan say this? Would you say, yes, we are number one? Or would you be a little bit more grammatically correct and say, yes, they are number one? Even though we are number one, Benjamin says, even though we've never stepped foot on the football field, even though we might have never played a snap of football in our entire lives. We want to associate with success. We have a desire to be familiar and to be close to fame. And it runs through all of our veins. The psychologist Robert Cialdini coined an acronym for this. I think he gets a little bit closer to hope, and he called this acronym BIRG, B-I-R-G. And it stands for this. It stands for basking in reflected glory. And here's what he concluded. He concluded, do you ever meet a famous person at some point? Remember my experience with Chuck Norris in the airport? I saw Chuck Norris at the airport in Dallas, and I said what all people say when they see a famous person, that's Chuck Norris, man. And I was like so excited that I saw Chuck Norris in the flesh. We conclude that some association to fame leads to our very own self-worth and significance. Why is that? Why are we so attracted to the life of the rich and famous? It's not only that most of us want fame, but we also want to be around fame. We want to be around success. But the question still remains, why? Why does it keep pulling at us, and why does it keep pulling at our hope strings, if that makes sense? Let me ask it this way. Why is our culture that is known, why is our nation that is known for breaking away from a sovereign king always trying to look for royalty through other beings, whether they're celebrities, pop stars, athletes, or the rich and the famous? We've concluded that nobody can have that much power in a government and still be a moral person, right? We've structured our government around it, but even when we don't have a king, we create them. We look for them. We want royalty in our lives. C.S. Lewis wrote this in one of his lesser-known essays. I think it gets down to the heart of it. He says, where men are forbidden to honor a king, they honor millionaires, athletes, film stars instead, even famous prostitutes or gangsters. For spiritual nature, like bodily nature, will be served. Deny it food, and it will gobble poison. And here's what he's saying. As human beings, we were created to worship the true king. As human beings, we were created as hope-shaped creatures, to find our significance and value not in us, but in the king, the eternal one true king of heaven and earth. And when that option is taken away from us, we will manufacture one according to our own world and our own likeness, and eventually that will kill us. It will lead to our own demise. This morning, we're going to continue in our sermon series on hope through the Psalms. And here's what we're doing. We're just going through the 5 books of the Psalter, and we're talking about the beginning of those books and the end of the book. Psalm 1 and 2 it's the preface psalm, these 2 psalms, for the entire book of Psalms. We'll get into chapter 3 next week that forms the first bookend to book 1. And we're talking about hope. And as we look at Psalm chapter 2 this morning, I want you to know that this is a royal psalm. This is a psalm that was probably sung during a coronation of Israel's king, Israel's true king at that time. And we're going to ask a few questions. We're going to make a couple statements as we work through this Psalm chapter 2. Number 1, we're going to ask this. Why do we reject the one true king? All of us, apart from Christ, reject him. So why is that? Number 2, we're going to ask, where is the king? In Psalm chapter 2, you're going to see a lot of statements about where the king resides. He is on the highest hill. He is on Mount Zion. So we'll talk about that. Why we reject the king. Where is the king? What will the king do? And number 4, how to respond to the king. We'll work through those 4 things in Psalm chapter 2. This is a very straightforward, very structured psalm in the book of Psalms. You've got 4 stanzas, 3 equal verses for each stanza. Every 3 verses, you've got a new stanza, so it progresses very nicely and orderly when you look at it. But whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament, here's the thing. Christian hope is firmly rooted in a king, in the Messiah King, who is coming to redeem and set up his kingdom on the earth with perfect righteousness and justice forever and ever. And so if you want a solid hope into your life, here's what you got to have. You have to have the true king. And if you don't have the king, you don't have hope. You don't have a biblical perspective of hope. Number one, why do we all reject the King apart from Christ? Number one, look at Psalm 2, and we'll read through the first 3 verses here. Psalm 2, verse 1. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. Now, the psalmist begins with a rhetorical question, and we're presuming that this is David who writes the psalm. We're going to talk more about book 1. Almost every psalm in book 1 is written by David. It's one of the distinguishing factors of book 1. We're presuming this was David, and he wasn't looking for an answer to that rhetorical question. He was expressing outrage. How is it possible that the nations reject or deny the one true king that has been sent from heaven? How can the nations reject the one true king that has created the heavens and the earth? How is this even possible? Notice the strength of the verbs as you look through here. ESV in verse 1 has rage. Why do the nations rage? The Hebrew word is ragash. It's in a perfect tense. Why have the nations raged, past tense, with the present result that they keep on raging against the Lord and against his anointed? Rage occurs only here and 3 times in Daniel chapter 6. And if you remember Daniel chapter 6, that's the lion's den chapter of Daniel. Remember the Babylonian officials that were trying to catch Daniel praying to his Lord and his God so that they might find something against him to throw him into the lion's den. This is the raging. It's not just the emotion that's depicted by this word, it's also the actions that are in line with that emotion of anger, of being upset at the Lord. The other parallel verbs, verse 1, plot. Verse 2, the kings of the earth set themselves against. That's the Hebrew word yatsav. Yatsav means simply to stand. The kings of the earth are standing up together against the Lord and against his anointed. Literally, they take their stand. The NET says this: they form a united front against the king. Have you ever heard this phrase before? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So any enemy of the Lord, the kings of the earth are saying, that's my friend in this context. The other kings are depicted as having no other reason to join forces except for a common enemy. We went to Israel several years ago. Got to visit the Holy Land. It was a great trip that we took. And as part of this trip, for a very short amount of time, you didn't do this for very long, but our tour guide took us to the very northern part of the nation of Israel. And on the north is the border for Lebanon, and to the east is the border for Syria. And if you go there today, you will see a very long chain link fence that's right there. It's called the UN safety border that was put there several years ago that distinguishes between the land of Israel and the land of Syria. And we go up, and we're on the base of Mount Hermon in the north. And we get out of the bus. There's about 30 of us that are in this touring bus. And we get out, and our guide just calls everybody really close. He says, this is as far as north as we're going to go in the land of Israel. And as he's talking, we hear machine guns being fired, like off in the distance. I didn't feel like I was going to catch a ricochet or anything like that. But you could hear there was some warfare going on in Syria, just neighboring to us. And our tour guide's name was Erez. And I'm thinking to myself, and I'm asking Erez, like, hey, man, I realize we're here to see Mount Hermon, but dude, am I going to get shot right now? Because if so, can we get back in the bus and I'll go to Tel Aviv really quick so we can get back to Oklahoma where people aren't fighting one another, right? And he said this is an interesting statement. He said, don't worry about what's happening right now in Syria. He said, nobody's in leadership there. And so all of these little armed forces, all these little leaders are trying to gain momentum. They're trying to gain a following by defeating all their enemies. And so they're so busy fighting one another right now that actually Israel in the north is pretty safe. We're in a safe place to be. Then he said this. He said, once somebody becomes the leader and once they figure out how to unite forces, that's when they're going to come and they're going to start to come into Israel. And that's when you got to watch out. And that was about, 5 years ago or so. And now we're seeing, of course, it would have been about 7 years ago. Now we're seeing a lot more turmoil over there than we have before. The purpose of these kings is to form a united front against the true king, against Israel's king. Look at verse 2. The rulers take counsel together. That means they are collaborating in their conspiracy. They are conspiring with one another. Notice who they conspire against. In your text, it should be capitalized, against the Lord and his anointed. Is anointed capitalized in your text? That's the Hebrew word Mashiach. That's where we get the word Messiah from, against Christ, against the Messiah, a title referring to the anointed one. The raging, the plotting, the conspiring is all very focused, and it's directed against a specific individual, against the King of Israel, the Messiah. Verse 3 is a direct quotation from the unbelieving kings and rulers in Psalm chapter 2. Each stanza will have a direct quotation in it. Stanza 1, 2, and 3. Stanza 4 is the only stanza without a direct quotation. And so follow the quotations as this passage unfolds, okay? Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords, is what they say. Cords is not the typical word for rope in that context. If you remember the story of Samson, remember when he said to Delilah, his weakness, he can be overcome if you tie him down with ropes. All right, so the Philistines come upon Samson, he's tied down with the ropes, and he breaks the bonds right away. Delilah's like, hey, what's the deal? You told me to tie you down with ropes. He said, well, if you tie me down with new ropes, stronger ropes, that's really what will keep me down, right? That's new ropes is the same Hebrew word right there. This has to do with a yoke, something that you would control animals with, or the rope that you would use to tie a sacrifice to the altar, a living animal sacrifice down to the altar. And the thought was that the king's yoke is a burden. The true king of Israel was restricting and he was enslaving. Now, here's what's behind this text, because Psalm 2 is not just quoting rebellious kings. Psalm 2 is not just given for this particular context at this time in the life of Israel. There's an application for us here today that we can learn from. Psalm 2 is a commentary on every individual human heart apart from Christ. And listen, many of you won't believe me, so let me give you some instances about this. Many of you look at this text and you say, listen, I'm not a Christian, but I'm certainly not crying out against God. Christians and their God is fine, but I'm not this person who is enraged. I'm not plotting against the king and this Christian God that you claim. How many of you believed in Jesus growing up in the church, maybe through high school and middle school, but then at college you sort of went away from the faith? I think almost every testimony that I've shared from new members, probably in the last 3 years here at TBC, somebody has that story in their background. And why is that? Why would we want to abandon our faith once we're outside of our family in college, in our own individual lives, and our own people apart from our families? We want freedom. We see Christianity as restricting. We see it as enslaving. And so there's something else that we think is there for us. Or think about what Jesus said. Jesus said stuff like, you cannot serve God and money. Right? You're going to love the one and hate the other, hate the one and love the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Disciple comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, I'm ready to follow you, but let me first go and bury my father. Remember what Jesus said to him? Let the dead bury their own dead. As for you, you come and you follow me. It seems restricting. Throughout the Gospels and throughout the Old Testament, God is saying to his people, I must have first place in your heart. I am a jealous God. And if anything else is given first place, you are not following, you are not worshiping the King. And so here's the real story behind Psalm chapter 2. There's a little Frank Sinatra sitting on the throne of all of our hearts. that gladly and gleefully sings, we want it our way, and that we will brag that we did it our way. Why? Because we don't want the way of the king. George MacDonald has a fascinating thought about this. He says this, he says, the most central conviction of hell is that I am my own. The most central conviction of hell is that I am my own, living my way. We all want fame, we all want royalty. If we can't have it, we desire to be around it. So we reject the king because we want freedom. We want our way, we want our rule, we want our agenda. We want control over our lives. The nations rage, unbelievers rage against the king and his rightful rule in their hearts and in their lives. Why do we reject the king? We don't want the slavery of the king. Number 2, where is the king? Look down at Psalm 2, verse 4. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. He will speak to them in his wrath. He will terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. One of the things a great writer will do when you read novels, you read great books, is they will depict 2 different perspectives of the exact same event that's happening through the lens of different characters. All right, so one of my favorite fiction books to read in the Chronicles of Narnia is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And one of my favorite stories in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is when the Dawn Treader is this ship. It's this vessel that has the Pevensey kids, Eustace, Clarence, Scrub is on there, and the normal Narnia figures are all on this vessel. And each chapter is an adventure or something that happens to the cast of characters that they didn't expect, and that leads them maybe to a closer relationship with Aslan somewhere in the story. One of the chapters, the ship sails into this dark abyss, this deep darkness. In fact, it's so dark. Have you ever been in a place before that it's so dark, you put your hand in front of your face and you can't even see it before? We went to the Grand Canyon one time, and there's like no cities close to the Grand Canyon, I don't think. I got out of the car with my family, and we couldn't see where the car was. We were stumbling over each other. We made jokes about somebody who was going to fall into the Grand Canyon because we didn't see the edge of it. There are dark places where you walk into that darkness and you can't see anything, right? So in this chapter in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, this ship goes into this dark abyss. They can't see anything. And right here in this dark place, all of their worst nightmares start coming true. All of their greatest fears and insecurities start happening right before them. And so there's chaos all around. They're hearing shrill voices. They're hearing loud shouting. Nobody's knowing. They're hearing people that are coming aboard the boat. And down below on this boat, there's nothing but noise and chaos. And right in the midst of it, Lucy figures out that she can climb the mast of the ship and go to the crow's nest and sit above it. And you've got 2 perspectives now in this chapter. You've got chaos, noise, unbelievable fear below. And then you've got Lucy sitting in the crow's nest, totally peaceful and calm, looking to the horizon when she first begins to see a light. When you read Psalm 2, verses 1 through 6, you're seeing 2 different perspectives. Despite all the chaos and the scheming below, Psalm 2, verse 1 through 3, there's a different perspective from above. Psalm 2, verses 4 through 6. Totally different. Calm, quiet, and peaceful. Verse 4 starts this way. He who sits in the heavens laughs. Below there is raging, plotting, scheming, and planning. Above, the Lord is sitting. He is sitting and he is laughing. Look at Psalm 115, verse 2 and 3. It says this, why should the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. In other words, the Lord is sovereign over all of these things. Despite what the nations are plotting, scheming against him and against his anointed, he is still sovereign over it. He is still in control. And nothing can threaten his sovereign rule over the world and for his future kingdom as it comes and as it's depicted for us in Scripture. This is the first reference in all the Psalms to a city called Zion in these verses. You'll see that over 40 times in the entire book of the Psalms. Zion was originally a Canaanite city, and you read about it in 2 Samuel chapter 5. This is the city that David captures, and he makes it his capital city. Eventually, when you see Zion in the Psalms, it refers to the whole city of Jerusalem. At first, it was a very specific place. It gets wider, and now it refers to the city of the king. Verse 6 also has a reference to my holy hill. Did you catch that? That specifically refers to the Temple Mount. This is the place of sacrifices. It goes back to Mount Moriah, to Abraham and his sacrifice of Isaac back in Genesis. It's the place of sacrifice to God, the place of the special presence of God when the temple was eventually built on that hill in Jerusalem. Verse 6 is extremely emphatic. There is no way that you could have written verse 6 any more emphatic than it's written in the Hebrew. I have installed my king on my holy hill. As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. Installed there is the Hebrew word pour out. Okay, so you would think the installation of a king. A new leader is being crowned here in Psalm chapter 2. But it's a drink offering is being made. So there's a ceremony that's probably behind the text here. At the installation of the king is the pouring out of a drink offering to God, who is being dedicated to God. While the nations and kings plot below, the true king is being crowned, seated above, and they are celebrating with a drink offering to God. Listen, the biblical perspective behind these groups of verses, verses 1 through 3 and verses 4 through 6, the biblical perspective is that hope changes your view of the world and everything in it. Christian hope should change your view of the world and everything in it. Despite everything that's happening right here on the earth in front of us, there is still a God seated on his throne above us, right? Despite whatever happens this year in an election year, and how chaotic it gets, there is still a Lord enthroned who is sovereign, who is over all those things. We can really still trust in the sovereignty of God no matter what's happening around us because he is enthroned over it. He is still in control of all of it. For a Christian, chaos can be all around you. Our job is to focus on what is above you. Colossians 3 says to set your mind on the things above where Christ is seated, not on the things below, not on the things of the earth. Why do we reject the king? Because we don't want the king. Number 2, where is the king? He is in the heavens. He is seated on his throne, and he does everything that he pleases. Number 3, what will the king do specifically? Psalm chapter 2, look verse 7. I will tell the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Verse 7 refers to a very specific decree from the sovereign king. Here's a question. By what right does the king have to rule? In Psalm chapter 2, what gives him the sovereign authority to rule? This passage is picking up on a very key chapter in the Old Testament. It's 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 14. I don't think I got this on the screen for you. I'm going to read this. 2 Samuel, you might just make a reference in your margins. 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 through 14. David says to Nathan the prophet, he says, I want to build a house for the Lord. At that time, there was no temple in Jerusalem. Who was the temple builder? Solomon. Solomon was the temple builder. That's one generation. That's David's son, right? So God says, David, you're a man of bloodshed. You're not going to build a house for me, right? But I'm going to give you a promise instead. One will sit on the throne who is your son forever and ever into eternity. And he will rule with righteousness and justice. It's the Davidic covenant. We first read about it in 2 Samuel chapter 7. You also find it in 2 Chronicles. I believe it's 17 in that chapter. 2 Samuel 7, verse 12. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, this is to David now, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body. I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever and ever. Verse 14, I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. So God expressed that he would be a father to the king, and the king would be a son to him. Son of God in the Bible is not just a phrase of relationship. It's a phrase of kingship and Messiah language. Today I have begotten you refers to a coronation, not a birth. This is not a reference to the birth of Jesus. This is a reference to the coronation of Jesus, and you'll see it in the Gospels that way, typically at the baptism of Jesus in the Gospels. A voice comes from the clouds, from the heavens above. You are my son. In you I am well pleased. And that's a combination. Part of that reference comes from Psalm chapter 2. The Father grants the Son his inheritance. Everything belongs to the Father, but he passes it to the Messiah, to the Son as his inheritance. Verse 9 is quite graphic here. We wish that verse 9 wasn't in the text, right? Give me verse 7, verse 8 all day long. You shall break them, break whom? These nations, these kings that are conspiring against you. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Those are strong words in Hebrew. The stem emphasizes a plurality of function. It's not just breaking them, but it's breaking them and shattering them into small pieces, right? This is very graphic language. God's victory over enemy nations is decisive, it is swift, and it is overwhelming. And so the time to decide to follow the one true king is not in the future. That time to decide is now, in the present tense. Number 4, how do we respond to the king? How do we respond to the king? Let's finish this off. Look down at verse 10. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear. Rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. First, I want you to see something here, because Psalm 1 and 2 really do go together. Psalm 1 and 2 are two parts to a whole. It's a natural outflow from the things that we saw, these patterns that emerged in chapter 1 of Psalms. Psalm 1 verse 1 starts how? Look back at your text. Blessed is the man. Psalm 2 verse 12 ends how? Blessed are all who take refuge in him. From the first verse of Psalm 1 to the last verse in Psalm 2, you've got a great bookend there that's comprised of blessing through the one true king. Psalm 1 verse 6, for the Lord knows the way of the righteous, the way of the righteous. Psalm 2 verse 12, kiss the Son lest you be angry and you perish in the way. Again, these two word associations are bringing these two chapters closely together. Psalms 1 and 2 function as a preface for the entire Psalter. While Psalm 1 wants you to think about the law of God, meditate on the law, understand who he is, grow in his person and in his work, Psalm 2 wants you to serve and worship the Lord as King. You see a great interplay here of God's word and God's rule. How do you find hope and refuge in the Lord? Number 1, you submit to his word and you submit to his rule over your life. You let him take his throne over your life and give him control. Psalm 2 wants you to serve and worship the Lord as King. Psalm 1 wants you to meditate on the word of the Lord and his law. So the psalm closes with several commands. These are all Hebrew imperatives, and you got a lot of them. Verse 10, be wise, be warned. 2 in verse 10. Verse 11, serve the Lord, rejoice in the Lord. 2 in verse 11. And then verse 12 is an interesting imperative, kiss the Son. And all of these are used to tell the most powerful, the most wealthy, and the most significant in the culture at that time, stop rebelling and start humbling. Stop fighting against the Lord and his rule over your heart and start humbly submitting to the Lord and trusting and living ultimately for him. Notice the urgency, lest you perish in the way. There's urgency in this text. Behind it, there's no time to delay. We don't know what's ahead of us. We don't know what's ahead for tomorrow. The time to decide whose side you're on is now. Trust in the true King. Did you catch the last line of Psalm 2? Blessed are all those who take refuge in the King. Refuge in the King. When we were at Mississippi State University, it was had an awesome college experience, right? And some of you guys are going off to college. I really encourage you. My man Ezra up there, go off to college and find good Christian friends and figure out life apart from your parents. It's going to be good. Micah, you're up there. You've done it. Man, he's 1 year, a couple years behind you. Listen, there are places that you will go in life. How many of you trusted Christ in college? People raise your hands. How many of you guys were impacted by Campus Crusade, Cru ministry, followers of Christ? You are going to need, when you go off, you are going to need a place of refuge, all right? Because figuring out life at this journey and this stage of life is completely different than anything else. People either really do, they turn on to the Lord in their relationship with Christ in their college days, or they sow their oats, they go the completely different direction. But there's not really a whole lot of middle ground in that college stage. And all of you, if you're going to keep the faith that you've had from high school, that you've been brought up with in your families, you need a place of refuge. For us at Mississippi State, that was my pastor's house. I was probably there daily at Mississippi State. I would show up, he left the door open. We'd come and crash on his couch. He called it the deadly spot. This huge sectional that was probably like 30 years old, and he just sunk in it. It didn't matter what was going on in my life. It didn't matter the fact that I was 750 miles away from anybody and anyone that I knew. It didn't matter that I didn't have a car when I was first down there. It didn't matter that I was on my own for the first time. I knew I had a refuge that I could go to. I knew I had a safe place that I could go to. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in the King. What do you need to do this morning to find your ultimate hope and your ultimate refuge in Christ the King? Let me give you a couple things to think about. True refuge and hope is found not in a place, it's found in a person. For a Christian, true refuge and hope is found not in a place. It's not in my pastor's house. It's not in your favorite vacation spot. It's not on long walks on a beach, right? True refuge and true hope is found in a person, not in a place. The word used for refuge in Psalm 2, verse 12, is typically defined as a physical shelter from the storms, a place that you would go to get away from the things of life that were all around you. It was found in high places in Israel, where in the ancient Near East, the high hills are the places that the gods dwelled for other religions. And the high heavens is the place that God dwells for the Hebrew and even for the Christian. We know that God created the heavens and the earth. This is deeper than the mythical gods of the ancient Near East. People who found refuge in the Old Testament were those seeking it from other gods. They were seeking it from Egypt. Often the nation of Israel was against a stronger power that was right in front of them. And so here's what the text said. Israel turned to refuge in the shadow of Egypt because they thought that an ally with a foreign nation was going to help them more than their faith and their trust in the one true God. Refuge is found in a plant. Remember Jonah at the end of his story? He goes on the side of the hill to figure out what's going to happen to Nineveh. This plant grows over him and gives him shade by day. And he's comforted. He finds refuge in the plant. When God is depicted as a shelter, it is altogether different in the Old Testament. We are under the protection of his wings. We are in his shadow. He is the rock into which we go for permanent, ultimate refuge and safety. In Psalm 2, he's the true and the rightful king. Therefore, finding refuge in God is not just where we go, it's to whom do we go. It's submitting to his will, to his way, and ultimately to his sovereignty. There are two types of people on the planet Earth. You guys have probably heard this before. There are those who say, my will be done, and there are those who say, thy will be done. If you're going to find refuge in the Lord, I hope you find yourself on the latter part of that option. Thy will be done. Number 2, the result of finding refuge in God is blessing and salvation. The result of finding refuge in God is blessing and salvation. Jeremiah 17:17 has an interesting phrase in it. It says this, listen carefully. You are my refuge in the day of disaster. And Jeremiah writes during a really disastrous, chaotic time for Israel. He cries out to God, you are my refuge in a day of disaster. Listen to what John Maxwell says. He says, where there is no hope in the future, there is no power in the present. Because of Christ, we have every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. Because of Christ, we have salvation and we have ultimately eternal hope. Thomas Fuller put it this way, hope is the only tie that keeps the heart from breaking. Hope is the only tie that ultimately keeps the heart from breaking. And so all of us in this room, as we read through Psalm 2, all of us are in this room. It's amazing what happened last Sunday. I heard from a handful of people that said, Jared, I'm so grateful that you're doing this sermon series on hope. I've got this thing in my life right now, and I just really needed Psalm 1. All of you listen to these sermons through the book of Psalms and thinking about hope. You're all thinking about areas of your life that might bring you to fear, anxiety, that might feel chaotic. But Christ, the Messiah, is our strong refuge. And we don't go to hope in a place, we go to hope ultimately in a person, in a relationship with him. And so no matter what's happening around us, no matter the diagnosis that you might have, no matter the family issue that's in front of you, no matter what you're experiencing today, you can have a hope in the heavens above from a perspective where our God is seated, enthroned above all things. And no matter what's happening around you, that eternal hope gives you a perspective of a king who is always and always will be in control of every aspect of your life. And even when it seems like things are out of control, and even when it seems like God has taken his hands off the wheel, we can still trust that he is seated in the heavenly places in control of all things. Sometimes God places us in those situations to ask us where our ultimate hope lies. Sometimes God places us in those situations because we're living in a fallen world, and that's just life in a fallen world. Sometimes God places us in those situations to test us and to ask us, who is Lord and King over your heart? Let's pray.